Hey, everybody. Hope you all are having a great week. We are going to continue our qualitative unit by talking about some qualitative data analysis. So very, very exciting. And if you remember, we talked about data analysis during the quantitative section, right? That numerical data analysis. And there's some key differences here. So that quantitative data analysis that we've already talked about is that process of using statistical methods to describe, summarize, and compare data. So using SPSS, using descriptive data, cross tabulations, correlations, ANOVAs, t-test, regressions, those things we talked about on the stats side. But now there's this qualitative data analysis component that we're going to talk about as well. And qualitative data analysis is the process of organizing and analyzing and interpreting qualitative data. So remember, qualitative data is that non-numerical, conceptual information. And what we're trying to do here in qualitative data analysis, and what it says up there, is to capture themes and patterns and answer our research questions and identify actions such as in applied research. And this relies on interpretation and it relies on various forms of analysis, not like using SPSS and stats, but a different type of analysis that we'll talk about. And just be thinking about all of these sorts of non-numerical data that is produced from qualitative research methods, right? This is very different than your survey data out of Qualtrics, for example, right? We looked at that numerical data in SPSS. These are very different. So whether it's diary accounts, documents, case studies, photographs, audio recordings, video recording, transcriptions, that's a biggie. We'll get into that. Descriptive traits, descriptions, observations, like your field observation is an example of data analysis. We'll get into how would we analyze these pieces of data. So be thinking about this type of data as a through line. And there are different techniques for qualitative data analysis. So and one technique would be documentation. So a detailed and systematic recording of data. So like a field note, like in your field observations, or interview transcriptions, which we'll be using, or memorandums, including documentation of data, of the data actual collection process for transparency and replicability. Remember, this is very much similar to your field observation assignment, where you talked about what were actually the data collection methods and then how your actual recording of the data. 2, organization and categorization. So an example here, grouping data into more meaningful categories or codes or themes. You're going to be doing just that. And this may involve inductive and deductive coding processes. We'll talk about that in just a second. You'll understand that soon. 3, connection of data. So identifying the relationships and patterns between concepts, mapping out how one concept influences or interacts with another. So causal links or shared context of things. 4, corroboration and validation for qualitative data analysis. So here you're evaluating alternative explanations and confirming certain evidence. So searching for negative cases that challenge initial findings to enhance credibility, or triangulation here to confirm findings through multiple data sources or methods. And then finally, 5, representation of findings. So summarizing and reporting findings in a coherent and structured manners. This can involve narrative accounts or visualizations. Think of diagrams and charts, word maps, excerpts from qualitative data to illustrate key data points, quotations, block quotes. These sorts of things are really important. And just again, some summaries here again, that it's important to have detailed record keeping in all of this. And we're going to talk about coding and all those sorts of things here just in a second. You're going to get a lot of practice actually doing this before and during your interview analysis assignment. So what is the qualitative data analysis process regarding interviews and focus groups? Because that's our big focus here, is on interviews and focus groups, right? That's what we've been doing. That's what we are going to continue to do. That's going to be your practice, especially on the interview side. So number one, you're collecting observations and notes. So you're recording context, you're recording emotions, body language, nuances between words. So on your interview guide, let's say you print it out or you're making notes on the interview guide itself throughout the interview. You can say, well, was uncomfortable answering this question. Seemed confused at answering this question. Seemed not to want to go down a specific trail of thought here. Those are the types of observations and notes you can include. Number 2 is a big one, interview and focus group transcripts. So These are things like verbatim transcriptions or summarizations based on your specific research needs. So a transcript, which we'll get into actually in the next slide, is where we're actually getting a verbatim or often at least close to verbatim account of what the conversation actually was. So you get the word for word, who said what, but you can actually read through it. You don't just have to listen to the audio recording. So number 3, data familiarization. So making sure you're reading and rereading transcript to understand the data set fully. You want to make sure, especially qualitative, you want to understand that data set and the nuances of what's actually in there. 4, coding. Just mentioned it. We'll mention it again more and more. Defining categories and themes by labeling text segments. So you're labeling, let's say someone says a certain thing, you want to highlight that and label it as, hey, this goes to this theme, this key theme in the research. We'll talk more about that. And number 5, identifying themes. So you're grouping your codes into patterns or themes relevant to your research questions. And then finally, 6, analyze and interpret. So link your findings back to the sociological theories and concepts you're concerned with or that you need to do further research on, and reflect on the context and meaning within the data. So that's the qualitative data analysis process that you're going to take. These are the things that you're going to do, especially for your interview practice assignment. So, but let's talk about transcriptions, because this is a really, really important component. So after conducting an interview, after you conduct an interview, you will a transcription is going to allow you to take the contents of the interview and effectively analyze it. So coding, which is the data analysis process that you're going to use, requires a transcript. So a transcription of an interview is a written document that captures the complete spoken conversation between an interviewer and an interviewee. So essentially converting an audio or video recording of the interview into a text format. And that allows for more detailed analysis and reference later on. So it includes every word spoken, depending on the type of transcription. Often even the transcription also often include pauses and ums and other nonverbal cues, again, depending on the transcription style, to even get that nuance. So you can transcribe your audio recordings with varying levels of specificity and utilize various methods, from doing it manually. So that's literally you listening to the recording and writing word for word and pausing it, going back, word for word, pausing it, going back, word for word. That can take an exceptionally long amount of time. But there's also auto transcription software, or you can outsource it and pay people to transcribe your recordings. Luckily for you, I'm going to transcribe your recordings for you. We're going to use the software and do it that way. So I'm not going to make you verbatim record it word for word, but just remember that that is a method that is still done. What's the purpose of a transcription? So why transcribe? Again, it's really significant that to have a transcription for capturing accurate data to support that thematic or content analysis. So transcriptions help in organizing large amounts of qualitative data, make it a lot easier to identify patterns. So if you didn't have a written account, how are you going to actually analyze that effectively? If you just got to listen to things and remember time codes or things like that, a transcription allows us to better analyze our data. So the transcription process is, again, whether manual or automated. So the time commitment and cost and accuracy of all these things go into it. So manual transcription is often probably a bit more accurate, but it takes such a long amount of time. Software or AI that transcribes your recordings, yes, that can be, you can cost a certain amount of money. It can be a little bit less accurate, but it saves the researcher a significant amount of time. So there's a lot of different transcription softwares. Just know that it can be done automated or manually. Ethical considerations in transcriptions too. So it's important to stress that confidentiality and informed consent are critical. Remember, we've talked about that. And so particularly in qualitative research, where sensitive personal information may be shared or can be more likely to be shared. And so I encourage you to think about those ethical challenges of a transcription, right? Especially with identifiable content like names and locations, that sort of stuff that they talk about. It's important that we de-identify and have anonymity as best to our possible ability that we can as researchers. And then there's also a post-transcription analysis. So the need for thorough review of transcripts, encourage that the transcripts need to be accurate, number one, but we want to make sure that we're identifying themes and patterns. And so I'll show you how we do that. We do that through a coding process. So I'll tell you how to do that and show you how to do that in just a second. But I want you to familiarize yourself with this process, that what actually is the purpose of a transcription? Why are we doing this? It's going to make more sense and more sense as we go along. But there's three different types of transcriptions here as well. So there's a verbatim transcription, an intelligent transcription, and an edited transcription. So a verbatim transcription is, like I mentioned before, transcribing every word, every pause, every stutter and filler words, such as the ahs and the ums when you're naturally speaking. An intelligent transcription is transcribing every word, but making an interpretation to include or exclude pauses or status or filler words, and potentially cleaning up the grammar. An edited transcription is common if you plan to publish the transcript to an audience. So it's cleaned up and it's edited to increase more readability and clarity. You can edit grammar, remove run-on sentences, even potentially summarize parts for the sake of clarity. So edited transcriptions are oftentimes done in novels or historical accounts, nonfiction books, biographies, that sort of thing. Intelligent transcriptions I've used quite often. We're going to use verbatim transcriptions. That's what we're going to do. So you can have all the nuances of the ahs and ums of the world. And so you're going to be able to see actually what a verbatim transcript actually looks like. Now let's talk about, you've got the transcript now. What do you actually do with it? What's the point? Where does the analysis come in? This is the most important part. We're going to talk about coding, qualitative coding. So qualitative coding is the process of systematically categorizing experts from your qualitative data to identify themes, patterns, and key insights. So this involves breaking down large and unstructured data sets, so like interview transcripts or even focus group transcript discussions, into smaller, more manageable segments that are grouped under broader concepts. So there's various types of coding. There's actually two types of coding. There's inductive and deductive. So inductive coding, think of as a ground up approach. So codes emerge from the data itself without any preconceived notions. So it's useful in a lot of exploratory research for generalizing new theories. So this is where you start with the raw interview data, and then you read through that transcription and then identify your key findings and key themes based upon the codes that naturally are emerging to you. Now, deductive coding is more of that top-down approach. So this is where codes are developed before you actually analyze the interview transcription, based on theoretical framework or your research questions or notes from the interview or focus groups. That's like, say, I've conducted my interview and I know that, hey, I bet you there are these key themes that have come up because I have all these notes and there are these key identifiers. I want to make sure I code based upon those. So I'm going to identify key themes based upon that interview. So let's say I interview some students about their satisfaction levels with dining services at Concordia. And I know some of my key themes are pizza or satisfaction around pizza services, satisfaction around coffee, or a lot of people have the same desire that they want more soda selections. And I know that those themes are coming up in the interview, so I'm actually going to use those as a starting point. So you can either start with themes and then code from there, or you can start with the interview transcription and build codes based upon what we're reading. Now, I know where you're probably thinking. You're like, well, how do you identify which one you're going to use? Well, you're likely going to combine inductive and deductive coding. So most often researchers do use a mix of both approaches. So you're going to start with those deductive codings, those top-down codes, right? Where maybe it's on prior theory or research or expectations you have, or from the interview itself, you know a few things definitely are coming up, some key aspects of your research. You're going to start with those, and then you're going to refine and expand on codes inductively as patterns emerge. So for example, a researcher may begin with a code book. I'll show you examples of code books in a second, but discover new themes through that inductive coding process that weren't anticipated in the code book. So it's a fluid process where you're going to build and add new codes as you continue to analyze your interview transcriptions. The coding process, there are multiple rounds typically. So you're going to have a first round of coding. So you're going to read through your data and you're going to initially code it, summarize and describe those key points. And then you're going to want to do a second round of coding. So you're going to revisit that data with your interpretive lens and refine your codes and grouping them into maybe even broader or more specific themes. Now, when possible, we won't do it for this class, but when possible, when you're conducting qualitative analysis and qualitative coding, you're going to have that third round of coding as well, where you use peer review or interrelate or use another researcher code the same data to ensure consistency and credibility. So you get another person's perspective on it to also code. Maybe use your codes, but also can add to them as well to gain that type of validity there. And then you can use subcodes as well. We'll take a look at these code books and see what subcodes look like. But subcodes are under those main codes to specify and further describe the specific phenomena occurring. So subcodes add depth to your analysis by providing more and more detailed insights into those main themes. So let's talk about the benefits of coding next, and then I'll actually show you examples of what coding actually looks like and what a code book looks like and what a coded transcription looks like. So some key benefits of qualitative coding. Number one, increases validity. So qualitative coding provides organization and structure to data so that you can examine it in a more systematic way to increase the validity of your analysis. It also decreases bias. So qualitative data enables you to be aware, or qualitative coding enables you to be aware of potential biases in the way that the data is analyzed. Accurately representing participants. So qualitative coding allows you to evaluate if your analysis represents your participant base and helps you to avoid overrepresenting one person or a group of people. And then finally, enabling transparency. So qualitative coding enables other researchers to methodologically and systematically review your analysis. So a much better, transparent way to go about it. Now, we talked about coding because this is critical for your assignment. You're going to do this, and don't worry, we're going to practice this in class together. But I linked a couple of coded transcriptions here and a couple of code books. So these are actual code books from projects that were done in the social research lab. So I think a couple I might have been a part of. I don't actually recall, but these are examples of code books that you can actually model your code book off of. So it gives you a framework to work from. So let's start with an actual code book. Oops, excuse me. Let's start with an actual code book. One second, let me make sure I'm logged in. Technical difficulties, everybody. There we go. All right. So here's what a code book looks like. So you're going to see those codes, those big ideas. Think of the codes as the big themes that come out of your interviews. Of what are your key themes that came from your interviews. So these are examples of codes. And you see there are two pieces of a code book. You've got your actual codes, and then you've got your comments. So describing your codes. Maybe your subcodes are examples of this. So the codes for these interviews, the big themes that came up in these Justin Patton interviews for this certain project, I don't recall the project, was defining what gentleness is, or applying gentleness as a concept in leadership, results and implication of gentleness in leadership, confidence, control and self-control, candor, compassion, civility, competition. Examples of just codes of what's actually coming up in the interviews. And then you see comments throughout of how do you define that, or what are some specifics that are coming up. So now let me show you what an example of a coded interview with this would be. So let's try this one. So see, you've got your interview transcription where it's time-stamped. You have word for word who's saying what. So you have your speakers, you have the questions and the answers. So your interview is actually literally on paper now. So it's typed out, your interview. So this is how you code it. Let's say, you know, these codes coincide with this interview transcription. So if I want, let's say someone said something that had to do with defining gentleness, I'm going to code that as the same color as the code that's in my code book. See how that's, the question was exactly asked by the researcher, how would you define gentleness? And so the person started asking, I would define gentleness as the ability to carry a message, or when I think of gentleness, I think it's whether the message, a service, or a conversation, communication. And so they answered the question to a certain degree, right? And so they answered the question of defining gentleness. So you coded that. You highlighted that section with the same color as your code in your code book. Going down the list in the same exact way, right? If it was confidence, you highlight it in yellow. So let's say I want to go look at where they might have said something about confidence. So I look for any yellow highlight in here. Oh, look at that. There are areas where the person said stuff about confidence. So I think that it does in the context of leadership because there's a connection between confidence and security, yada, yada, yada. So that's how you can actually code and organize your qualitative data. This is how we go about it. So any sort of, you're going to come up with your own themes, your own codes, and then you're going to code your interview just like this. So when they start talking about things that are related, and I can go back to them like, oh, what is this light blue? Light blue is can. Oh, they're talking about candor then. And then add descriptions about it. So that's how we go through a large transcript and actually organize our data. So that's how I want to show you another example though. Show you another code book. Here's another example of how a code book can also be done in a non-Excel format. So here is the type of format that actually you're going to use, an Excel format, because it's more organized, it's easier, but there are also ways that you can do code books in a Word doc. See how it's you have the codes listed in the same sort of way, with the same sort of highlights. You can do the same sort of add notes here, an example of a code book, and then let's also add another coded interview here. So again, another example of what a coded interview actually looks like, where you're going through the entire transcript and highlighting specific segments that the person is answering about your key themes. And you're going to go through it a couple times, right? You might have themes identified and you highlight, and then as you're reading through, you realize, oh, this is actually it's another separate theme. So you go back to your code book and add another theme with a new color. So that's how we do basic coding, okay? And if it's confusing, that's okay. Review these. Take time to review, especially this Excel code book, this spreadsheet code book, and then the coded interviews to see where that makes sense, where it all aligns, because you're going to actually do this process. You're going to practice this process, and then you're going to do it for your assignment. So this is really all I wanted to cover today. Let's talk about what is qualitative data analysis, what is qualitative data coding, why is it important, why do we do it, and then what it looks like. How we actually do it, I described a bit, but you're going to get that practice very, very soon.